The global story with China continues, but first let's talk about what's happening here at home. President Trump is going to be meeting with the Secretary General of the North American Trade Organization today. Yes, NATO. The meeting at the White House, part of a celebration in D.C. by NATO this week of its 70th anniversary. Joining me now for a preview of what this week's festivities are going to bring, Conference Board Senior Economist Erik Lundh. Erik, I don't know about festivities because we've already heard from Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO chief, and he basically is coming to D.C. and saying that Europe is committed to NATO. Look at all this money we're spending for this military storage in Poland. President Trump says, hey, wait a minute, most of the countries in NATO are not spending 2% of GDP. They are breaking their promises. This is going to be a tough meeting.
Sure. Well, the president's actions on NATO have had some beneficial results. The amount of money that European countries are spending on defense has been going up recently. So he is having an impact there. In terms of the president's willingness to actually follow through with some of his threats and withdraw from the organization, about 75% of Americans actually support NATO involvement. So while the president may say some things in terms of the U.S. potentially leaving or pushing back, the fact of the matter is that most of the U.S. public actually supports U.S. involvement in the organization. But
at the same time, the president does have a financial point, and I think that this is worth noting here, that only 6 countries out of the 29, that agreement was back in 2014, only 6 countries of 29 are actually living up to their promises. So that's going to be an interesting argument. Let's move to China because, and this has been a big market story, this new data was released showing that manufacturing growth in both China and the U.S. Has been strong, but Europe is the lagging story here. Obviously, trade talks between the U.S. and China kicking off this week in D.C. What do you think is going on?
Well, these trade talks have been going on for a number of months now, really since December. We've been hearing notes from both the Chinese and the U.S. side saying that progress is being made. Last week, there were discussions in Beijing. Cybersecurity, cloud computing, things like that were discussed, and concessions were made to the U.S. This week, I think what the U.S. side is still trying to push is an enforcement sort of mechanism within the treaty. Mm-hmm. So that's a bit of a sticking point. We'll see what happens when Liu He comes to Washington. But if that can be moved forward, I think that we're going to have a better chance of striking a deal over the coming weeks.
The Chinese vice premier, but there still seems to be concern about Chinese enforcement. And they did just give us a temporary stay on the suspension of tariffs on automobiles. That started January 1st. The Chinese have agreed to let that continue. There's also concerns that if they are going to be willing to buy U.S. goods, farm products, and that could be billions of dollars, if they do that, still the Chinese government would dictate which products are going to be bought and exported over to China. And some say that that gives the Chinese still too much power.
Well, I mean, that's really a function of the way the Chinese economy is run. It's not a market economy in the same way that we have here in the U.S. The fact that the state-owned enterprises play such a large role in the economy gives the central government there the ability to basically dictate to them who they should be buying from and how much they should be buying. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the Chinese negotiators agreeing to make more purchases from the U.S. can happen via this pathway. But if something were to happen, the Chinese government could then go ahead and tell these same SOEs to stop buying from the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly it's all going to be in the agreement that we hope to see President Xi Jinping and President Trump sign at the end of the day, whenever that's going to be. Erik Lundh. Erik, thank you for getting up early. We appreciate it.
Great to be here.